Welcome all to London, and welcome to the absolutely beautiful and splendid British Academy, and welcome to the conference on sensory substitution and augmentation. Before I begin, I would like to say thank you to a few people. First and foremost, the speakers and the commentators, and indeed the chairs at the conference. Thank you all so very much for being here. And in particular, the speakers and commentators who are going to be partaking in our demonstration event on Thursday afternoon. Thank you all for those extra special efforts. It's much appreciated. I'd also like to thank John Bird, who has been helping me with setting up the demonstration event. His help has been very, very welcome. I'd also like to thank all my colleagues and the students at Glasgow University who've been so incredibly supportive, and it's absolutely delightful to see so many of you here. I'm so excited that you could be here to join us. I'd also like to thank the sponsors of the event. So first of all, the Chancellor's Fund at the University of Glasgow, who have given some money to the Centre for the Study of Perceptual Experience, which is based at Glasgow. And you can read about the Centre for the Study of Perceptual Experience and the events that we run in some of the literature that you've been given for the conference. And I would also like to thank the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, who awarded a grant to the Network for Sensory Research. So our chair this morning is Mohan Matan from the University of Toronto, and he's the leader of the network, which involves philosophers and psychologists, but it's led by philosophers at Toronto, Glasgow, here in London, MIT and Harvard. And again, details of the network and the events that the network put on are in some of the literature that you've been given this morning. Finally, of course, their main sponsors for today's event are the British Academy, and I would like to thank the British Academy staff for their organisational skills, in particular Angela Pusey, but also Cheyenne King and Penny Collins. Okay, so I thought it would be good for me to speak at the beginning of the conference, because we have people here from psychology, people from philosophy, and maybe other fields besides. And I think that sort of maybe not everybody knows some of the facts about sensory substitution. I thought it would be good if we were all up sort of at a level playing field once we started the conference. So today I'm going to talk first of all about what is sensory substitution and augmentation and give you some examples of that. And then for the majority of my talk, I'm going to talk about what is the nature of the sensory experience that is had when people undergo sensory substitution. Now, there's several reasons why I've chosen this to be the sort of main focus of my talk. One is, it's just the thing that I'm most interested in. I think it's the thing that often grabs people when they get into this topic. But also I think it's probably one of the main areas where philosophers and psychologists can really work together and talk a lot about how we find out what's going on in sensory substitution and the nature of the mental phenomena. So in doing this, I'm going to talk about, first of all, whether there is indeed a new sensory experience. And then I'll talk about whether there's an experience typical of the substituted modality. That is, if we're trying to substitute for vision, do we really end up with a visual experience, say? And then I'm going to talk in more detail about what the nature of that experience is, what properties can we ascribe to that experience. And then finally, under this topic, I'll talk about what the limits of sensory substitution are. Are there any limits, and why might we think there are limits about what we can substitute for? And then finally, at the end, I'll just sort of gesture towards what I think are other important issues that people might be discussing during the conference. Okay, so what is sensory substitution and augmentation then? Well, in sensory substitution, one sense is used to try to replace a second sense. And attempts are made to deliver information to a subject via a sense that does not usually deliver that information. And what's crucial about it being a case of sensory substitution is that that information, we think, is normally delivered to a subject via another sense. In sensory augmentation, one sense, again, is used to try to, this time, create a new sense or to enhance an existing sense. And again, attempts are made to deliver information to a subject via a sense that does not usually deliver that information. But this time, what makes it augmentation is that the information is not normally delivered via that sense that you're using or another sense. You're usually trying to get in sort of information that a subject doesn't or wouldn't typically receive, or someone of their species would typically receive. So let me give you two examples of sensory substitution. First of all, there's the TVSS, or tactile visual sensory substitution, sometimes called tactile vision sensory substitution. The two terms seem to be used almost interchangeably. So that was, as many of you know, developed by Paul Bacchi-Rita, initially with someone called Carter Collins, but Bacchi-Rita went on to work with other people besides Collins. So in TVSS, in the original version, Paul Bacchi-Rita used an old-fashioned dentist's chair, which had a series of pins that could be pressed against a subject's back, much like you might imagine in one of these gizmos that you can buy in sort of cheap gift shops, right? So the way these work, as I'm sure you know, is that you press your hand against the back of the pins and the shape that you've pressed presses forward. So you can imagine sort of pressing that against your back and you might be able to tell whether it was a circle or a square and so on. And that's a basic principle behind the TVSS device. Rather than it being your hand that pushes the pins against to push them forward, which pins are driven forward is driven by the image that comes from a camera. And here you can see the camera sitting beside the dentist chair. Okay. So the image from the camera determines what pins push against the subject. Okay. And after a few hours of practicing using this TVSS device, it was found that subjects could come to recognise a range of common objects that were placed in front of the camera. And moreover, they could come to point accurately in space to those objects, so they could point to the left or to the right, up and down, and so on. And they could also, it seems, come to judge their distance and their absolute size. Now, when I say practice, what were the subjects doing in order to practice? Well, obviously, images one at a time or objects were being placed in front of the camera. But it was also said that the subjects had to be able to sort of move the camera themselves, and obviously they would be getting feedback about what image was being placed in front of the camera, either because the experimenter would tell them, you know, this is a horse or this is a doll, or the subject themselves would feel the object in question. But it said that the subject themselves had to move the camera around and sort of be able to pull the camera back, push it forward and so on, in order to practice and come to have the skills that are mentioned above. However, it seems to me that although people commonly say this, perhaps this is a little bit stronger than is actually required. So it's interesting about whether this is necessary. So for example, imagine it wasn't the subject themselves that was moving the camera, but someone else was moving the camera, but the subjects just knew how the camera was being moved. So perhaps the subject would be resting their hand lightly on top of the camera, and someone else would be moving it, but the subject would know themselves that it was going forward or to the side and so on. Would that be enough in order to do the practice? In my opinion, I suspect it would be, but it's interesting that people don't mention this, that they always mention the stronger constraint that the subjects themselves had to be able to move the camera. Well, after further practice, so after about 30 hours of practice with the TVSS device, subjects could make complex pattern discriminations. They could recognise faces of laboratory staff, so you get reports of people saying, oh look, there's Sally walking through the door and I see she's wearing her hair up today rather than down. And a feature that has been pointed out a lot by people is that subjects displayed what's called a looming response when the lens of the camera was zoomed. Now, if you're an ordinary subject and you have vision and someone, perhaps maybe a Ned from Glasgow, starts rushing towards you, you get someone sort of rushing towards you, the space in your visual field that person occupies sort of increases very quickly. And the natural response that we as humans have is to pull back, is to sort of avoid what's zooming towards you. So what it was found was that if you sort of played a trick on the TVSS subjects and you zoomed the camera, which made it look as if things were suddenly increasing in size in the visual field or in the image that the camera was detecting, subjects leant backwards sort of fairly quickly and automatically. And this would be so even if the pins were pressing against their back. So they didn't recoil from what was pressing against their back, they recoiled from where the camera was pointing towards. And at this point, subjects give the following sorts of reports on their experience. They say initially they were only aware of the tactile stimulus or the tactile experience that they were having of the pins on their back. But after they'd done this practice, they reported that they became aware of objects in front of them in the world and that they were no longer aware of the tactile stimulus or the tactile experience on their back. Although, of course, if they sort of started to pay attention to that and sort of think, oh, is it there? Then they could sort of realise that it was still there. But they certainly weren't paying any attention to it when they were sort of fully engaged in using the device. And moreover, subjects reported their experience in quasi-visual terms. So they reported having an experience of space in front of them and objects being in that space, which sounds most like vision. Now, new versions of the TVSS have been developed, little portable devices so that you're not stuck in your dentist chair. And indeed, instead of pins pressing against your back, sort of little electrical nodules on a piece of plastic can be placed on your tongue and will give you a similar sort of stimulation as pins on your back. Okay. Now, a second example of a sensory substitution device is the voice device developed by Peter Meyer. Now, I know that scientists are very keen on sort of random capitalization within their words, but this one is quite clever. So voice, what's capitalized is OIC. Very good. What happens here is that the device in question, the voice device, takes a signal from a camera, as in the TVSS device, but instead of turning it into pressure against your skin or little electrical pulses on your tongue in the TVSS case, it turns it into a sound stimulus that people hear. So here's a subject who has worn this device for a long time. You can see she's got an earphone in and she has a little camera mounted on the side of her glasses. You can see it looks very discreet. What is the nature of the sound signal? Well, imagine that you were looking at a television monitor that's represented in the black. Imagine that's your television or computer monitor. And then imagine that there's a diagonal line going from bottom left up to top right, as in the diagram here. Well, the height in the diagram of the line gets represented by the frequency of the sound, in other words, the pitch of the sound. And the x-axis here gets represented by the duration of the sound that you hear. So what would happen? What would you hear if you were looking at a stimulus like this? Well, first of all, a click is sounded to tell you that the sound is going to begin. So you would hear a click here, and then there would be silence, and then you would hear a low tone, duh, and then it would ascend in pitch. So you would hear click, silence, duh, and then it would pause. And then there would be another click, and then the next image in question would be generated. And the volume of the sound in question corresponds to the brightness of each pixel. So the more white it is, the louder the sound, the darker it is. Well, when it's completely black, there's no sound. If there's grayscale that can be given in this device via volume, which can't be given via or isn't given via TVSS. In TVSS, it's merely a black and white on-off affair. Here, it's a case of grayscale images can be given or can be sort of translated into sound information. So just to give you another example, suppose you were looking at the stimulus up there. What would you hear? Well, you'd hear a click, and then you'd hear a small pause, then you'd hear a low sound for the dot, doot, and then a pause, then a high sound for the high dot, doot, and then a medium sound for the last dot, doot. Okay. My impersonations are not very good. Okay. Sounds a bit more electronic than that. Okay. So after some practice with this device, again, subjects can come to learn to recognise objects that are placed in front of the camera with some practice. And again, much like the TVSS, they seem to report vision-like experiences. So finally, I want to give you one example, this time of sensory augmentation, and recall that what makes something sensory augmentation is that one sense is used to try to create either a new sense or to enhance an existing sense. And this is an example of a new sense that was tried to create. So I'm trying to see where he is. Peter Koenig is sitting here. So this is, we're delighted that Peter's with us. He's going to be talking about some of his research on the field space belt. So this is a belt that contains a variety of different vibrators around the inside of the belt, and you wear it around your waist. And what drives which of the little vibrators vibrates is a compass, which is detecting where magnetic north was. So let's suppose magnetic north is in that direction. Let's suppose I'm wearing the belt. If I was standing in this direction, a little vibrator in the belt would be vibrating. This one here would be vibrating. And as I turned round, then in turn, each of the vibrators would turn. And now as I'm standing here, this one would vibrate. And as I'm turning around here, one on my back would vibrate, and so on. So the vibrator that's closest to pointing towards magnetic north would be the one that's vibrating. Okay. So Peter Koenig and his group report that after training of 6 weeks by subjects where they're wearing this belt all the time, subjects were better than controls at certain navigation tasks. Not all navigation tasks, but certain navigation tasks. And they had 4 subjects that they trained up for 6 weeks, and 2 out of the 4 reported having changes in their perceptual experience. They all said that it was hard to describe the new experience, but in some sense they said it was a sense of space that they got that was different from the mere tactile stimulation that they were getting around their waist. And somewhat unexpectedly for the experimenters, they thought that the people would say, oh yeah, now I've got this sense of magnetic north. It didn't seem to be like that. It seemed like the sense of space was always relative to local landmarks that the person knew. So we've now seen what sensory substitution and augmentation are, and I've given you some examples of sensory substitution devices and one of the augmentation devices. And we've seen that all these devices seem to allow discriminations of objects or directions in space in ways that didn't occur before, and the subjects often reported having quasi-perceptual experiences of some sort. So we might now ask, well, what's the nature of this experience that these people seem to be claiming to have? So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus in on the quasi-visual experience that's reported in the TVSS and the voice case. However, if I've got anything to say about the field space case, I'll mention that as we go along. So in the TVSS and the voice case, the subjective reports of the subjects attest to the existence within their experience of stable objects that are experienced in space external to the subject and in front of the subject, where the camera is being placed. And of course, the first question you want to ask is, well, is there genuinely a new experience that's being had here? I mean, clearly new information is getting into the subject that's allowing them to do discriminatory tasks that they couldn't do before, but is there genuinely a new perceptual experience? For example, might they not just be inferring on the basis of what they feel or what they hear? Might they not just be inferring the presence of certain objects? So in other words, might they not just be having beliefs or judgments as opposed to genuinely new perceptual experiences? Well, this is actually a very difficult question to address. I mean, it's very difficult to know when to think someone has a perceptual experience as opposed to when they're just making a judgment or a belief. And indeed, some philosophers have made arguments for saying that experiences just are beliefs. So David Armstrong, for example, has said that perception is nothing other than the acquiring of a belief about the current environment by means of the senses. And so he thinks that perceptual experience just is a particular kind of belief. Now, not many philosophers today believe that view, and I'm just going to presuppose for the purposes of this talk that there is that distinction to be made, that we can distinguish between perceptual experience on the one hand and belief and judgment on the other hand. But the question then is, well, how can you, if you're faced with a subject, how do you tell whether they're just having a new belief or a judgment or whether they're having a new perceptual experience? Well, the obvious thing to turn to is subjective reports, right? What does the subject say? Can they not just tell you, oh, I'm having a perceptual experience, or oh, I'm just having a belief or a judgment? Well, when we look at what they do say, they do seem to report new experiences. I mean, they say things like, oh, it's quasi-visual, or at least that's what the experimenters say after listening to them. But you might wonder here, how reliable are these reports of the subjects? After all, we don't have objective tests to see when if someone's good at reporting the nature of their mental life. We don't have accurate sort of ways of testing these subjective reports. So how do we know that they're sort of matching on to what the subject's mental life is like? And even in ordinary experience, so forget sensory substitution type experiences, just think about your own ordinary perceptual experience. Within that, there's great disagreement as to what the nature of your experience is like. So for example, for at least 200 or 300 years, philosophers have argued amongst themselves about whether your visual experience is two-dimensional or three-dimensional. And the people who say it's three-dimensional say, well, it's obvious, I'm having a three-dimensional experience right now. What do you mean? And they report having a three-dimensional experience. The people who believe in the two-dimensional view say, no, it's obvious, I'm having a two-dimensional experience and I'm just making a quick inference to three-dimensional information. So given that we have sort of even conflict in that very basic case, that might make you really wonder about the extent to which we can trust the judgments of these subjects. Another case, that, and there are very many to be honest, but another case is whether our visual experience is as rich as we take it to be. So some people have said, actually, you don't perceive colour, you don't experience colour in the periphery of your vision, and the visual world isn't as rich to you as people typically take it to be. Well, if that's right, we're all misreporting the nature of our subjective experience all the time. I'm not saying it is right, I'm just saying it's not obvious that we can just sort of trust in a straightforward manner subjects' reports. And there are many such cases like this. And when it comes to sensory substitution and augmentation, again, there are disagreements about the nature of the experience between the subjects. So I mentioned in the field space subjects that 2 out of the 4 subjects said they had perceptual experiences. That means 2 out of the 4 subjects said they didn't have perceptual experiences. So what's going on? Was one lot right, one lot wrong? And again, within those reporting on TVSS and voice, there are disparate reports. So some people say the experience is 2-dimensional, other people say the experience is 3-dimensional. I'm going to come back and talk at greater length about this point in just one moment. Now, there might be reasons for why there are disparate reports. I mean, maybe if everyone is reporting accurately, so maybe the presence of disagreement doesn't tell you that you can't trust the reports or the reports aren't accurate, because there could be many reasons for why we get different results in different subjects. A very important thing that I don't think enough attention is paid to is the fact that people using these devices have very different sorts of disability. Some people have no disability whatsoever. They're sighted subjects like myself who just want to strap one of these devices and have a go and play and see what it's like and so on. And then there are people who've been made blind late in life. There are people who've been made blind early in life. And then there's the congenitally blind, people who've not seen at all. Now, you might think that you just get very different results in different sorts of subjects. Another thing, obviously, to note is that you might get different results using different sorts of devices. Perhaps the voice and the TVSS give different sorts of experiences, or one gives an experience, one doesn't, one gives 2-dimensional experience, one doesn't. We shouldn't think that all these devices are going to sort of act on people in exactly the same way. It's also important to note the different training regimes that people have undergone when they're making the reports. Sometimes people are reporting after a couple of hours of practice, sometimes tens of hours, sometimes after 4 years of using a device, maybe 2 years of which you've constantly been using the device. So again, you might think that might make an enormous difference to the nature of your mental life. Another key fact seems to be the motivation of subjects. So some subjects seem incredibly keen to participate in these experiments. They're desperate to learn to use them and to see what information they can get from them, and they're highly motivated. Other subjects, however, just become demotivated very quickly. They don't like using these devices at all. And again, you might think the state of mind of the subject and to what extent they're sort of trying hard or engaging might again make a big difference. And also, indeed, there might just be innate differences between people for all we know. Okay, so things are very complicated at the very least when it comes to subjective reports. There is other evidence, however, that people claim shows us that the experiences are perceptual experiences. So the looming response that I discussed earlier, where people sort of automatically sort of lean back away from the direction in which the camera has been pointed in once they've trained up using the devices. Psychologists often say, look, this is a very fast and automatic response, and it's indicative of perceptual processing going on, rather than inference and judgment, which one might think aren't fast and automatic and take longer to accomplish. But with this, you might think, well, hang on a minute, couldn't there just be fast automatic inference? After all, that's the kind of inference that people think is taking place. It's got to be some kind of fast automatic inference. For example, if it's to account for three-dimensionality and so on, then it would be that kind of inference. So do we have really good evidence that this is a good test for perceptual experience rather than inference? It's not so obvious to me that we've done enough work on this topic. And again, it's not always obvious to me that the performance is automatic and depends on attention. I mean, sometimes it does look like it's automatic, but a lot of the times it looks like people have to be fully engaged, using the devices and really paying attention. And perhaps that maybe separates subjects in at least some cases here. Another piece of information that people often point to, indicating or trying to sort of argue for the thought that the experiences are perceptual, is that blind people who are congenitally blind report forming new perceptual concepts that they hadn't had before once they've used these devices. Things like parallax, shadows, and the interposition of objects when one object occludes another and comes in front of another. And again, people have said, well, maybe this shows you that blind people are genuinely having a new experience, and that's what's allowed them to form these new concepts. But again, the thought would be, well, couldn't they just form these concepts by inference? Maybe they're having experiences just, in the case of TVSS, maybe they're just having tactile experiences, perfectly ordinary, familiar tactile experiences, but ones, you know, driven by a camera, and that just is a set of experiences that allows them to infer and come to have these new concepts. And also it's worth noting that in many of these cases, recognition of the objects can take a long time. Like a good performance might take 10 or more seconds with someone using this device to identify what the object is. Again, this is very variable. It depends on device and it depends how long people have been trained and so on. But again, you might think that, well, maybe this is evidence that it's maybe it's not perceptual experience, maybe it's inference and judgment that's going on. Another thing that you might think is that, look, scanning the brain here, maybe that's the solution. Let's scan these subjects' brains and let's see if their visual cortex is active. And then if their visual cortex is active, that will give us reason to think that they're having visual experiences. But in order to think that that's a way to proceed, you already have to have set up nice correlations between the visual cortex being active and visual perceptual experiences occurring. And this is precisely one of these areas where there's a lot of doubt over what's going on here. A lot of people think that the visual cortex of blind people might precisely be being activated by these devices, but they don't come to have perceptual experience. Indeed, some people have been questioning whether we should really call the visual cortex the visual cortex at all, right? Maybe it's just cortex that does interesting stuff. Typically, it does visual stuff, but it can do lots of other stuff too. Indeed, just even in ordinary perception, my former colleague at Glasgow, Petra Vetter, as I saw her come in, Petra is here somewhere. Petra Vetter, who was at Glasgow, who's now just moved to the University of Geneva, has found that in just ordinary subjects, if she gives them an auditory stimulus, she can read off from their visual cortex what auditory sound has been played to them. So it's just not obvious here that we can sort of make these straightforward correlations between visual cortex is active, therefore someone's having a visual experience. And a final piece of evidence that people often talk about, both philosophers and psychologists, is that you can get persisting visual illusory effects using TVSS. So Paul Bacchiarita recreated the Muller-Lyer illusion and the waterfall after effect, sometimes called the motion after effect. So he created visual illusions or correlates of visual illusions using TVSS. And people have often said, look, perceptual experiences are states in which the world can be represented to you to be some way, even when you know the world isn't that way. So you know that you can be subject to the Muller-Lyer illusion. You know that the two lines really are the same length, but your experience continues to represent them to be different lengths, precisely because it is a perceptual experience. If it was a belief, then in the face of conclusive counter-evidence, a belief would have been overturned. So it's an interesting piece of evidence to consider. And there's lots one might say about that. So in summary, it seems like showing that subjects do have a new experience rather than are just making fast automatic inferences is really a big challenge for people. And in these kinds of cases, I think we probably have to just sort of rely on the weight of evidence. We have to sort of look at all these factors and kind of weigh things up. I don't think we'll ever have a nice, neat, simple, definitive test, much as that's the sort of things philosophers would love to see and are typically looking for. It's very hard to say here. I myself think that the weight of evidence tips over in favour of these people having new sensory experiences, but I think this is a delicate matter. Okay. So let's suppose then that these people are having sensory experiences. A lot of the questions I'm asking here you could still ask if you didn't make that assumption, but just for ease of exposition, I'll be assuming that people are having some form of new sensory experience. We've just looked at the question, is there a new sensory experience? So let's suppose the answer is yes. The next question is the experience phenomenally typical of the substituted modality? In other words, in the case of TVSS, is the experience an experience that's like one of vision, or is it just like a new one of a new haptic or tactile experience? Or in the case of use of the voice, the question is it a visual kind of experience these people are having, or is it just a new form of auditory experience? Now, it's important to distinguish that question from the question of which sensory modality should we assume that these people are using? Now, obviously, the nature of the perceptual experience people are having might feed into the question of what modality are they using. But either other information or instead different information might be used to settle that question. So, for example, some people think that what's crucial for settling this question is the nature of the proximal stimulus that's stimulating the subject, or the nature of the sensory organ that's at play. Of course, answering those questions is itself difficult, and thinking in general about does sensory substitution sort of cast doubt on whether we can neatly individuate the sensory modalities is an interesting question. But I want to leave the question aside of what sensory modality is being used and just ask the question of the nature of the experience that's being had. Is the experience a visual experience in the case of the TVSS and the voice, or is it not? Okay. So is the experience phenomenally typical of the substituted modality? So in TVSS use and voice use, it's often said that the subjects report that the experience is like vision, quasi-visual, or at least more like vision and touch. As I've said before, it seems to be an experience of stable two-dimensional or three-dimensional objects in space in front of the subject where the camera is pointed, which sounds very much to me like a visual experience, far more like a visual experience than like an auditory experience or a tactile experience. And sort of excitingly for philosophers, psychologists and their subjects are now starting to produce incredibly detailed reports of the phenomenology, and that's very helpful for us philosophers. So you might think, well, is there really a serious alternative here to thinking that these people are having vision-like experiences? And the answer is yes. I mean, one alternative is the thought that they're simply having an experience in the substituting modality. So in the case of TVSS, they're just having haptic experiences. In the case of the voice use, they're just having auditory experiences. So one reason to think this is that many researchers have suggested that using a sensory substitution device is like learning to read. So here's Paul Bachirita, who says the learning process, that's learning to use the TVSS to make discriminations, may be similar to that which takes place in children with normal sensory and motor systems, or in adults learning a foreign language or Morse code, or in deaf persons learning manual communication. And here's a quote from Jones, 2004, talking about Meyer, who is the inventor of the voice system. He says, Meyer likens the process of learning to recognise sounds as shapes to acquiring a foreign language. Novices begin by mastering an elementary visual alphabet, a circle, a rectangle, a triangle, an oval. Since, generally speaking, all other shapes can be said to be combinations of these, the wearer of such a device begins to gain fluency that makes recognising whether a door is open or closed or whether a chair is occupied almost second nature. Now think about when you came to learn to read. You came to be able to learn to recognise words, when you couldn't before. And the recognition process of the words became fast and automatic. You didn't have to sort of work out, spell out the letters anymore to yourself as you did when you were young. But when you come to learn to read, you don't think that you're having anything other than non-visual experiences. You're just having new visual experiences. And likewise, if you come to learn to be able to understand a language in speech, you don't think you're now that you can hear the language, you don't think you're having anything other than auditory experiences, although of course you're having new auditory experiences of a kind that you couldn't have before. So Malika O'Vray and Ophelia DeRoy, two of our speakers, I think they're on tomorrow, they're going to talk about this conception of sensory substitution tomorrow in their talk. So I'm going to leave discussion of this idea to them. Okay, so we've been thinking about what's the nature of the sensory experience. We've been asking, is it a new sensory experience? And supposing the answer was yes. We've been asking if the experience is phenomenally typical of the substituted modality, and there's some reason at least to answer yes, at least maybe thinking it's more like vision than touch, or sound in the case of TVS and voice. But okay, so now let's suppose that it is an experience that's more like vision than anything else. Now let's think a little bit about, well, what's the nature of that experience? So one big debate here is whether it's a two-dimensional experience or a three-dimensional experience. And another debate that's of interest is what can we say about the representation of colour in these kinds of experiences that people seem to be having. So is the experience that gets created, is it two-dimensional or three-dimensional? Well, Guarniero, who was a PhD student of Paul Bachirita's, and who was one of the first people to train to use the TVSS at length, he was someone who was congenitally blind, so he'd never seen. He wrote a paper describing the training process, which he trained for 3 weeks using the device, and after those 3 weeks, he sort of wrote about his experiences. So he says, very soon, the sensations, i.e. the sensations on his back from the pins, no longer felt as if they were located on my back. By this time, objects had come to have a top and bottom, a right side and a left, but no depth. They existed in an ordered two-dimensional space, the precise location of which has not yet been determined. And then with a little bit of further training, he said, in order to judge distance, I had to master some of the cues of monocular vision, namely familiar size and interposition. I also made use of the fact that when things are viewed from above, those further away appear higher in the visual field. Even when interposition was the only cue I used, the objects still appeared two-dimensional, and I had to infer that one was behind the other. So it's a very, very clear statement, I think, that his experience was two-dimensional. But here's another report, so this time using the voice device. This is a lovely paper by Jamie Ward and Peter Meyer, 2010. And they talk about two subjects they were studying, one called CC, one called PF. And they say both CC and PF report being able to perceive depth. However, both of them report that this ability occurred after having flat visual experiences of edges and shading. So here's a little dialogue between PF, one of the subjects, and one of the experimenters. So PF reports her sense of depth perception arising in a kind of eureka moment. So she says, I was washing the dishes and looked down into the sink to make sure that the water had got out, and I realised, oh, I can see down, I can see depth. And I stepped back from the sink and looked down again to make sure I wasn't filling myself. And I walked slowly through my house looking into the rooms, and it was like incredible. I could see into the room. That flat drawing now has depth to it. I can sense it. Now, this was after 4 years of training with the voice, 2 of the years which were completely immersive. So we have here someone who's clearly reporting this eureka moment of three-dimensionality, compared with a report that said, someone who said he only ever had two-dimensional experiences. So one question here is, well, when people have this sense of three-dimensional depth, is that genuinely part of their experience, or is it just an inferred part of their experience? Well, of course, that's back to the original question that we started out with. That's a very difficult thing to determine. But again, it seems here that there could just be different factors at play that gives different answers in different subjects. So remember, Guarniero was congenitally blind. He had never seen. Okay. PF, on the other hand, was late blind, and indeed she had some residual vision in one of her eyes. Very, very poor vision, obviously. But you might think here, well, perhaps it's the case that blind people would only ever come to have two-dimensional experiences. Perhaps the late blind or people who've seen and sighted people, perhaps they would come to have three-dimensional experiences. We need to be sensitive to these facts. And also, clearly, there were different training regimes going on here. So Guarniero was reporting after 3 weeks training. PF was reporting after 4 years of training. And of course, they were using here different forms of sensory substitution devices. So this makes things all very tricky. So another question that we might want to consider is, what should we say about the representation of colour? So you might have thought that colour, and I don't just mean chromatic colour, reds and blues and greens and so on. I mean any form of colour, including black, white, and the greys, what we call the grey scale. You might thought none of that is represented. Why would you think that? Well, obviously no chromatic information is given to subjects via the voice or the TVSS. The cameras are just using either black and white or black and white and greys. And you might have thought, well, yeah, but surely information about black and white and or grey is being given to the subjects. If you recall, I said in TVSS, the pins are either sort of touching you or they're not, and they're either signalling black or signalling white. In the voice, because we have the volume dimension, it looks like we perhaps have information about different shades of grey, about lightnesses, okay? But in the TVSS, consider how would subjects know whether the pins touching them indicated white or indicated black? You wouldn't know, right? You would just know there was a pattern on your back. How would you know whether it was a white shape on a black background or a black shape on a white background? There's nothing to tell you unless someone explicitly says to you. And likewise in the voice, how would subjects know that the existence of a sound corresponds to white rather than black, and volume signifies increasingly light white notes rather than increasingly dark grey notes? You could have set things up the other way around. So how are the subjects and how's the subject's brain to know this? Okay. Again, however, this maybe seems to be a case where we want to sharply separate what might be true of the congenitally blind from what might be true of the sighted and the late blind. So again, here's another report from Ward and Meyer reporting their subject PF, a late blind subject who has some residual vision. And she was asked, well, are you just hearing? And she said, just sound? No, it is by far more. It is sight. There is true light perception generated by the voice. When I am not wearing the voice, the light I perceive from a small slit in my left eye is a grey fog. When wearing the voice, the image is light with all the little greys and blacks. The light generated is very white and clear, then it erodes down the scale of colour to the dark black. Well, if you're looking for a subjective report, that seems fairly decisive. And indeed, rather interestingly, PF later started to say that colours had started to emerge in her experience. So she says, over time, my brain seems to have used my memory to colour everything. And the experimenter says, but if you look at someone wearing a sweater or pants, you wouldn't necessarily know the colour. It could be blue, it could be red. And PF says, my brain would probably take a guess at that time. It would be greyish black. Something I know, such as grass, tree bark, leaves, my mind just colours it in. So that's super interesting. It seems like this person is reporting that they're actually having experiences as of colour. Okay. But if memory is filling in colour for PF, then perhaps likewise she experienced light and the sort of grey scale because she's a late blind person with residual vision. It's tempting to think that a congenitally blind person who's never experienced light or greys or anything would not have this at all. Indeed, in a recent and very interesting study, Coopers et al. Found that when they used transcranial magnetic stimulation of the visual cortex, in other words, they use a magnetic field to stimulate the visual cortex in congenitally blind subjects, and moreover, those congenitally blind subjects had been trained up to use the TVSS, in particular the tongue version of the TVSS. If they then stimulated their visual cortex, they reported only experiencing things on the tongue. They didn't report anything visual, they didn't report phosphenes or little spots of light. By contrast, non-congenitally blind subjects who had been trained up using the TVSS, when their visual cortex was stimulated, they did report experiencing phosphenes. So that maybe makes us think, well, perhaps congenitally blind subjects wouldn't be experiencing whites or blacks or shades of grey. So just suppose for a minute that that's true. I'm not saying it definitely is, but let's suppose that that's true. Let's suppose that congenitally blind people don't experience colour, chromatic or grayscale when using the TVSS or the voice. Could there be vision-like experiences of objects at a distance from your body that don't involve experiencing colour? Not white, not black, not grayscale, not red, not blue, nothing. Well, Aristotle famously said that there cannot be visual experience of form, in other words, visual experience of shape, without experiences of colour. And he said that's just an a priori truth about the nature of visual experience. And that claim has been sort of echoed and repeated by many philosophers since that time. So those people think that that one experiences form at a distance from the body in virtue of perceiving colour. So how is it that you perceive form? It's only because you're perceiving colour properties of some kind. Well, to assess this claim, it's worth thinking a little bit about other sensory modalities. So let's think a little bit about bat echolocation. So as many of you probably know, bats send out a high-frequency chirrup from their mouth, and then they listen for the sound of the echo bouncing back off objects like little moths that they're trying to catch, or like trees in the forest when they're flying through the forest at night. And using this echolocation, they can negotiate through their environment very skillfully, dodging trees and branches, and sort of very skillfully catching moths and other little flying insects. So they're gaining a great deal of information in a very quick way about three-dimensional objects at a distance from their body. But obviously the bats are not detecting colour, right? The sound waves that bounce off things don't give you any light information at all. So they're not detecting colour, but they are detecting form. So you might think that perhaps bats are detecting distant form, that is not form pressing up against their body as we do with touch, but form or shape at a distance from their body by experiencing sound reflectance. So rather than experiencing form in virtue of colour, it looks like they're experiencing form perhaps in virtue of sound reflectance properties. So perhaps one needn't experience colour to experience distant form, but perhaps one needs to detect some quality or other. So if one must experience distant form by experiencing some quality or other, what quality would congenitally blind people using a TVSS or a voice experience? Would they experience light reflectance? I mean, is there a chance it could be that? But of course, the subjects needn't know what signal is driving their TVSS. Of course, we could have set it up that it was a camera and that it's light that's inputting into the pins pressing against them. But we could have set up an echolocatory system where it was sound reflectance that was driving the pins pressing against them. So what's to say for them or for their brains whether it's light rather than sound reflectance that's driving the tactile stimulation on their body? Well, now you might think, well, okay, maybe they experience visual form by experiencing the pressure on their body. Or maybe they experience visual form at a distance in virtue of the sound that they hear in the voice system. Well, maybe so, but that's very, very difficult to imagine. I suppose I just almost draw a blank in imagining how could you experience form at a distance from your body in virtue of the property in virtue of which you're doing that is touch. Not just in a causal sense, as in the touch is causing you to do that, but experientially the property that's distinguishing form is touch on your body. That's incredibly hard to imagine. So given that, you might think that that should lead us to think that perhaps there could be experiences of pure distant form, experiences of form not had in virtue of experiencing any other property. In fact, I think we have two reasons to think that maybe this kind of experience is possible. One comes from an experiment that was performed by Rogers Ramachandran and Ramachandran in 1997. So what they did was they took a uniformly grey background and they coloured it in with black dots on one side and white dots on the other side. And the stimulus was such that at the minute when the black dots turned to white dots, the white dots turned to black dots. And the two varied back and forward sort of very quickly in this fashion. Now, it turns out that if you increase the frequency of the dots varying back and forward to basically anything over 7 hertz, but they used 15 hertz, you can no longer tell whether the dots are flashing in phase so that they're all black, all white, all black, all white, or whether half is black and half is white. You just can't tell that anymore visually. But what subjects did report was a phantom contour at the boundary area between the black and the white. And if indeed you increase the area of the white dots, or these dots versus those dots, subjects could tell that the contour was moving, but they were unable to tell that whether the dots were in phase or out of phase. So Rogers Ramachandran and Ramachandran say, although subjects cannot discriminate the temporal phase relationship between the field of spots, they can nevertheless see a phantom contour separating the two indiscriminable fields. So it looks like they're having an experience of shape, in this case a line, but not in virtue of a difference in colour or a difference in texture or any other property of that kind. Now, obviously, this isn't an experience of pure distant form without colour, because they were seeing the grey and the dots and so on. But they were experiencing form without an experience in the difference in colour or the distance or a difference in texture and so on. So I think that kind of experiment is, at the very least, highly suggestive. Another case that's worth considering here are cases of what people call amodal experience. And in order to understand this, I need to explain to you the difference between modal phenomena and what's called modal completion from amodal completion. So if we look at a figure like this called the Kanizsa triangle, you should see a triangle with a point pointing upwards and its base along here. And it looks to us as if there's a lightness boundary that's marking the edges of this triangle. Of course, we know this is an illusion. There's no difference in lightness between this area, and if I was just a little taller, I could point up a little bit higher between the area inside the triangle. But visually, it looks to us as if there is a lightness boundary. So here we're experiencing form in virtue of experiencing a difference in lightness. And this is called modal completion, because people are saying you're experiencing within vision some difference. But compare that case, the modal case, to the case of amodal completion. So if I show you this figure, then most people report seeing a square that's occluded by a circle, as in this picture. Okay? However, of course, the top picture is perfectly compatible with a square with a jaggedy edge being present. But I take it that unless you know this research, you wouldn't have experienced the top figure as being a square with a jaggedy edge. In fact, we have very good reason to believe that people report, in some sense, seeing the top figure as being a square behind a circle. Now, obviously, there's no lightness difference within your experience here. There's no difference in lightness that marks that sort of missing edge of the square that makes it a square as opposed to a jaggedy square. So people call this amodal completion. Well, maybe you might think, maybe that's something like experiencing a pure distant form. It's not exactly like it, because of course here we're experiencing the whiteness of the background, but it looks like we're having an experience of form without an experience of a difference in lightness or colour or texture. So, as I've said, this isn't a case of pure distant forum, but it's suggestive. It maybe suggests that, points towards thinking that there could be such cases. And let's suppose that there were such cases. Would they be best classed phenomenally as visual experiences, or would they be best classed as phenomenally amodal experiences? Well, I think it's hard to say. Of course, Aristotle, who says a priori you cannot have a visual experience without an experience of colour, would have to say they're phenomenally amodal. They're not experiences of, they're not visual experiences. But for us, well, it's hard to say. It seems like they've got more in common with vision or visual experiences than with any other experience. So in virtue of that, it's tempting to think that they're vision, but yet they would be quite different. So it's very hard to know whether to describe them then as visual or as amodal. So either way, whatever turns out to be true, I think sensory substitution is a fantastic case study to get us to think hard about what I call these structural features of experience, thinking hard about whether certain features of experience are essentially linked or tied together, or perhaps not actually within our experience. Okay, so now I want to turn to the last sort of topic within the topic of what is the nature of the sensory experience, and that's what are the limits of sensory substitution. So what kinds of sensory substitution are possible? So in the TVSS and the voice, and indeed the feel space, we're only substituting for spatial properties. We're substituting for shape or for distance or for direction. Okay. Now, these are just 3 examples I've chosen. Obviously, they're examples that are incredibly prominent within the sensory substitution and augmentation literature. But is that significant? Is it significant that we are only substituting for spatial properties? So could one substitute for other properties? Well, we've already looked a little bit about the case of colour, and we sort of thought, well, maybe there's a difference. Maybe people who are congenitally blind, maybe you can't substitute for colour for them. Maybe people who are late blind, maybe they do come to have a sense of grayscale, or maybe even colour if their memory is filling in certain things. It's interesting. But what about other things? What about taste or smell or sound? What if you lost your sense of taste? Could we create a device that would allow us to substitute for taste? So what do we do when we substitute for space? Well, it looks like we map each spatial dimension, typically just a 2-dimensional camera image, onto 2 other dimensions, 2 separate dimensions, which are created out of a set of qualities in the substituting modality. So for example, in the feel space belt, it looks like we're taking 2-dimensional positions around your body that gets mapped onto 2-dimensional egocentric direction of magnetic north. In the case of the TVSS, we've got the 2-dimensional pins pressing against your skin, and that maps onto the 2-dimensional space of the camera image. And in the voice case, we've got auditory pitch and the time of occurrence of the sound mapping onto the 2-dimensional space of the camera image. So one might think that to substitute for taste, you have to create a similar mapping from one modality to a taste space. Now, in taste, it said there's arguments over how many basic tastes there are. So there's bitter, salty, sweet, sour, umami, maybe metallic, maybe it's as yet undecided. Just for the sake of argument, I'm just imagining, because it's hard to draw more than 3 dimensions, I'm imagining that we're trying to substitute for a 3-dimensional space of bitter, salty, and sweet. But suppose we created a mapping then. We used 3 dimensions in some other modality, one of which corresponded to bitter, one of which corresponded to salty, and one to sweet. How would the subject know that they were supposed to map that onto a taste space, or onto a smell space, or onto a colour space? After all, in the spatial case, well, we told them that it was going to be objects at a distance from their body. They could feel those objects during the practicing, and people would tell them what those objects were, and so on. And you might think here, well, can we just tell the subject? Can we say, right, this is the bitter dimension, this is the salty dimension, this is the sweet dimension? But in the spatial case, subjects have the ability to represent space in the other modalities. So they've already got touch and hearing, wherein they already have representations, or they have the ability to represent these dimensions. But suppose a subject had never had taste, or suppose they'd had taste, but then they'd lost taste and completely lost the ability to remember or imagine taste. How on earth could they represent taste, even if they were told what the mapping was? I say, okay, this is increasing bitterness. But if I can't imagine bitterness or remember what bitterness tastes like, I've never had an experience of bitterness, how's that going to have any impact on me? I mean, sure, I might come to learn to say, oh, that's very bitter, that's not bitter at all, but it doesn't look like I'm doing anything particularly with the sensory experience. And even if the subject, imagine the subject had lost taste, but they still had taste imagination. Maybe then you might think, well, maybe they could imagine the taste, and then maybe they could come to automatically and quickly imagine all these sort of tastes that were going on. But I just think, surely that would be an incredibly impoverished sense. After all, you know, quite often I want to go on a diet, and my problem is that imagining the taste of chocolate just doesn't do it for me, you know. I really need to taste the chocolate. Imagining tasting the chocolate is such a poor substitute for the taste. So at the very least, this would be an incredibly impoverished sensory substitution device. It wouldn't be what dieters were looking for example. Okay. So maybe that leads us to think that either in people who completely lack, have always completely lacked a sense, or perhaps even in everyone, one can only substitute common sensibles, not proper sensibles. That is, perhaps we can only substitute for properties that can be represented in more than one sensory modality. So things like movement, number, shape, time, and so on. And maybe we can't substitute for the proper sensibles, or at least maybe there's many more challenges in trying to substitute for those things like colour, taste, smell, and sound. So if just the common sensibles can be represented, then this basically restricts sensory substitution to spatial temporal properties, and perhaps that makes the possibilities of the types of sensory substitution that we can have more limited than you might have thought otherwise. However, knowledge of spatial properties is absolutely crucial for getting around the world. So if you had to sort of choose what set of properties you wanted to be able to give people, then you might think that maybe those would be the ones you would choose to have. Maybe they are going to be the ones that are most useful for people who have disabilities of some kind. Okay, just to finish off, I want to mention one or two other issues which I imagine will crop up during the conference. So one is, what theories of perception does the existence of sensory substitution support or undermine? And in this respect, people have talked quite a lot about whether what are called sensory motor theories or representationalist theories are either supported or undermined by this research. In my own opinion, it's not so obvious that really anything we learn really helps here, but I know that a lot of people think otherwise, so I'm very interested to hear what people have to say about that during the conference. Another important issue, particularly for psychologists, but increasingly philosophers, is what light will this research cast on perceptual learning, on issues to do with neuroplasticity and neurofunctioning. After all, this is a sort of very radical case, it seems, of perceptual learning that happens very quickly, so it's a very interesting case to study. It looks like a case where the brain seems to be changing its function, and as I said, there's lots of interesting work being done on whether we should think of the visual cortex as really being visual, or some kind of amodal processing area or something like that. So is the visual cortex genuinely visual is a question I expect will come up during the conference. Another question is, does sensory substitution cast doubt on the way that we individuate the senses? And I mentioned this case a little earlier. Is it so clear that we can really carve out a case for something being visual as opposed to being perhaps some interesting form of cross-modal experience? There are all sorts of ways in which it seems that we can have cross-modal experiences of the world, and maybe that starts to sort of undermine our ideas that there are these very different, discrete and distinct senses. Another question that I know some people here are very keen on addressing is, why is it that some people who are blind or disabled in some way or lacking a sense do not seem very keen to use these sensory devices? Now, obviously, this is quite variable, and some subjects are very keen to use them or really want to, but there's a sense out there that perhaps the sensory experiences that people come to have, if indeed they are sensory, are kind of lacking in emotion and lacking in effect. Sometimes when people saw their partner's face for the first time, they didn't have warm, fuzzy feelings that you might expect when you see your partner's face. They found everything very flat, and they just didn't seem particularly keen to use these devices. So why is that? Why are there differences between people? What can we do about that? It would be nice if some people would mention that, and I imagine they will. And can we make things better? If so, how? And finally, hopefully future research will help us produce better devices, or indeed will reveal the limits of sensory substitution and sensory augmentation devices. So thank you very much. Yeah, if we have questions.
So we have a little time, about 20 minutes for questions.
So can I just say one thing before we start? So I'm very happy for people just to mention other things that they would like to get out of the conference. If there's any other issues that you're interested in that I didn't mention, then please feel free just to tell me why you're here and what you would like to hear about.
Just a quick question. Your example of taste, while Bob just shout. It's been recorded. Oh, right. Quick question about your example of taste. Have people done trying to substitute auditory things using visual, for example? Because that seemed like another one that's just a single sense.
Not to my knowledge. No, and not that I know of in the case of taste either. So those are interesting ones that that we should be thinking about. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that question. Maybe I don't know if anyone else here knows of people trying to replace sound, trying to substitute for sound.
Just once. Barry?
Thanks, Fiona. Great summary. Unfortunately, you've used all of my commentary, so I'll think up something new by the afternoon. But just wanted to ask you about the point you made about common sensibles, because that was something I was thinking about too. So maybe maybe we can only substitute when we're targeting common sensibles, but it's not obvious that you only need to use things which participate in detecting those already, like hearing and like touch. I can imagine you could move to using taste or smell to try to get at some of those features. Might be a very complicated learning experience, but if you could do that, then in a sense what you'd have done is extend the range of modalities that can pick out the common sensible. So you might not get the limitation just to be the classic three: vision, touch, and hearing.
Just to be clear, so do you mean that you can use different modalities to do the substituting for the common sensibles?
Yeah.
So I think that's right, and I think that the case of TVSS is where we're using tactile information to substitute for vision, or at least trying to. The voice is a case of using auditory, but I agree with you that perhaps we can definitely use other modalities. The question I was asking though is, what can we do the substituting for? Are they limited to the common sensibles?
Yeah, but still there would have been something new here, right? Because you'd have said, we used to think the only other things that can get at the common sensibles are, well, Aristotle thought touch, and then we might add hearing. But if we use the others, then
absolutely.
Yeah.
It looks like as long as you have different dimensions within other sensory modalities that one could use to kind of correspond, then I think that's right. And I think the TVSS in the voice case shows that. Why couldn't we extend it further to taste and smell? I think that's exactly right. We could do it. I don't see any limitation there. Great, thanks.
Kevin?
Yeah, so I found it interesting what you were saying about color and the differences between early blind people and late blind people. And you talked about how one obvious difference between the two is that one group has memory of color and the other group didn't. But I had two questions on that. So the first is, what exactly do you take the experience of a late blind person to be in that case? Is it some sort of hallucination, maybe? Is it some sort of inference? And then secondly, do you think that this filling in might be going on with other properties? So you talked earlier about two dimensions and and 3 dimensions. Do you think that something like that could be occurring in those cases as well?
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting whether it's inference or whether it's perceptual experience. I talked a lot about that, and I think in these cases it's very difficult to determine the answer to that. I think we just have to sort of weigh up all the evidence and make a judgment call, and it's just not often very clear which way one should jump. When it comes to, is it hallucination? It depends how you define hallucination. So it looks like these people can somehow, or their brains, are somehow conjuring up phenomenology, which might be imagistic, or which might be sort of stronger, which might be sort of the kind of phenomenology we associate with ordinary perceptual experiences. Again, that would be a nice thing to do some tests on PF, like how strong is this colour phenomenology? Is it the kind of phenomenology we think is a bit like the phenomenology of imagination, or is it more like that associated with perceptual experience? And I don't think anyone's done that research, so fantastic questions, and I don't know.
Yes, so this is really a one-finger question on the first question, but there is a long history of trying to translate, give a mapping, if you like, quite complicated, sometimes very systematic, rather systematic anyway, mapping of sounds into colours. Almost always the sound accompanies the colour, but there's a whole sort of history of abstract animation which does that. So, but I was just thinking, as I was thinking that, it does use amodal things. So it does use, obviously, timing is crucial for the visual stimulus copying the sound artifact and so on. But anyway, there is, and I would just mention Oscar Fischinger, or you could Google sound organs, yeah, in order to find something that might work to do it in a device. Anyway, it would be interesting to try.
So in all these cases, people set up correspondences between usually a spectrum of colours, sometimes a colour wheel, or sometimes like the rainbow colours. So some ordering of the colours is made, and then that's typically matched on to some ordering of pitches. But the setup there is completely arbitrary. So when you look at different artists throughout time, they've used very different notes to correspond to different colours. Some have used different keys to correspond to different colours. In cases where we know people spontaneously report colour in response to sound, in the case of people with synesthesia, again, the mapping here seems to be pretty arbitrary. Maybe there are some patterns lurking in, that we can detect, but pretty often it looks like it's completely arbitrary, the mappings here. And there's a man whose name is escaping me, who has done a TED talk where he claims to be a human cyborg, the first human cyborg, and he wears, oh, someone's saying his name? Stephen Mann.
Neil Harbison.
That's the one, Neil Harbison. Thank you, whoever said that out. So Neil Harbison wears a device which detects wavelengths of light coming from objects and plays him colours. And he's a chromatopsic, so he's never naturally seen colours through his eyes. He's only ever seen in black and white and grey. And I've sort of done a little bit of research on his case, and although he can quite often identify colours, he can say, oh, that's red, that's blue, and so on, and he claims, oh yes, I hear colours, there's no research which has been done which says he's actually having colour experiences, as opposed to he's just hearing a note and says, oh, that note corresponds with red. So I'm actually incredibly sceptical of that kind of case.
There's a question at the back in the middle.
Thanks. So I was interested in how these things compare to cases of people who have regained their vision, say, after a long period of time of not having it. My knowledge of these cases is pretty old. So I know about cases in the middle of the 18th century where children who had been basically kind of blind since birth or had very, very limited vision because of very severe cataracts have their cataracts removed and can suddenly see for the first time. I kind of looked at these when looking at the Molyneux problem.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about these cases is there does seem to be a lot in common in the way that they describe their experiences with the way that you have described the experiences of people who have been using these alternative sensory equipment. So some of these children, when they could first see, reported it feeling like the world was touching their eye, or like the images were touching their eye. And it was only after a while that they were able to see things as separate to themselves. So that seems similar to the case where at first you feel like it's touching your back and then you perceive things differently. Also, for a lot of these cases, it was as if these children for a long period of time had to learn a foreign language. So a lot of the time they would learn a couple of new visual words a day. They'd be able to kind of see things, but they wouldn't be able to identify them automatically. They'd say, oh, okay. So there was one nice example of a boy who has a cat and a dog. And even after a couple of weeks, he would mix up visually which was the cat or the dog and have to bend down and pat them before he could work out. You know, it was as if they were giving labels to their different, the different objects of their experiences. And I wondered if you see this kind of, I mean, who knows, these cataract removal was not exactly a fantastic surgery and their vision was probably pretty impaired at the time, but if you could make comparisons between people actually gaining vision where they had not had it and people who are gaining something like vision where they'd not had it before, maybe the similarities kind of take away some of the doubts that you had with the other systems.
Doubts about what, sorry?
Oh, so doubts about whether if you are you really perceiving something if it's more like learning a foreign language? Is it that you're actually making judgments? Well, in the case of these children, it seems like it is a bit like learning a foreign language, but we can say that they're definitely perceiving because they're using, you know, their visual systems. Or is it perceiving if you're moving from feeling like it's touching one part of your body to experiencing it as outside of yourself? Well, once again, with these children, it doesn't seem like it's just a judgment, even though we know that they're using their visual systems.
Great, thanks. That's a fantastic question. I like that a lot. So I think you're right that just because there may have to be some period of learning that resembles maybe something like reading or similar in that way, that doesn't automatically show you that we do not have a perceptual experience at play here. So I'm very happy to agree with you on that. There's been some work by Parvan Singha, who's a surgeon at MIT who goes to India and who removes people's cataracts. It's a fantastic project that he has. He raises a lot of money to do this work, to give people operations where they would never typically have these operations, and then he does great psychological research on them. And he's found that very quickly after the cataracts are removed, so within hours, subjects can do perceptual matching tasks. So if you show them one picture, they can straight away match to another picture. So they can tell you these two pictures are the same, these two pictures are different. They cannot do cross-modal matching tasks. So if you ask them, if you give them like Molyneux's test, you give them a circle and a sphere to feel, and then you show them a picture of a circle or a sphere, they cannot do that, despite the fact they can do perceptual matching. And that's the kind of, you know, really crucial part of his research, is that they can do that. After some time, very interestingly, what you find is if you give subjects a lot of photographs and ask them, can you name these objects? And you collect the ones that they can name and the ones they can't. And you give those same pictures to ordinary sighted people. And you ask the ordinary sighted people, divide up these pictures into the ones which are things that move and things that don't move. So cars are things that move, bathroom taps are things that don't move. You find that the movement, not movement sort of divvying up of the categories by the sighted people corresponds almost precisely to the things that people can name and can't name in that case. Yes, it's a lovely thought to compare and contrast those two cases of people gaining sight and people learning to use TVSS, and the fact that there's some relevance or some similarities to learning to read doesn't automatically show that there's no perceptual experience. I agree.
Okay, we have time for two more questions, and first Ophelia and then back. I feel it as a mic coming.
Just going back to the issue of common sensibles and proper sensibles, I was wondering what you would say about, if you know the paper, the experiment by Tyler and Barry Rita, where they claim to have restored vestibular, to have compensated for vestibular deficits. So sense of balance doesn't seem to be a common sensible through tactile stimulation.
So I think that is a case where you're restoring a common sensible, because I think what you're doing in that case is you're restoring people's sense of direction of the position of their own body. So again, it's a spatial piece of information that you're giving to people in that case. In this case, it's a sense of which way is up. And of course, that's something that we can get through our eyes on some occasions. It's just that in order to function in the way that we as humans do, it's not enough to get those things through your eyes, it seems like. So again, I think that's just a case of a common sensible. It's spatial direction that we're giving to people and which they can use to keep themselves upright, particularly when they close their eyes.
Well, one worry here is that given that's already some information they can have, for some part of their body, that's just not sensory substitution, that's like sensory aid or sensory additional supplementation. Do you want to draw that distinction in that case? Or?
Sorry, I didn't hear your question.
If you're just giving more information, like they can't access the information about the position of their head because they are not looking at themselves in a mirror constantly. So what you do is giving them that information through their tongue and tactile stimulation. But of course, they can see the position of their limbs visually otherwise. So what you just do, you extend some sort of information they already have.
It looks like we're replacing the information that they typically get through the vestibular sense, and it looks like it's not just giving the information that they would get through their eyes for two reasons. One is that they typically can't use that information through their eyes to keep themselves upright. And the other is that the information that we get through our eyes is such that we're constantly trying to maintain a sort of constant view of the world. So if we tip our head to the side, it doesn't look to us like the whole world sort of tipped, right? We maintain that we maintain a kind of an upright view of the world, right? We still can tell that which way is up here. And what we can't do, it seems, through vision alone, although at least without a great deal of sort of inferential thought going on, is sort of use the visual information plus information about the position of our head to then work out exactly what way is up. This seems to be a fast, direct way of giving them information about the orientation of their body, which they normally get through the vestibular sense. So I do think of it as sensory substitution, and I do think of it as replacing a common sensible information about space.
Okay, one last question right at the back there.
Just two quick comments about the issue of the sight restoration and the example of Pawan Sinha. So I think, first of all, they, like in the Molinar case, they can't do it immediately, but they can develop the ability to do cross-modal quite fast.
Yep.
And the second thing is that I'm going to present actually some data using the voice of comparing several hours of tens of hours of practicing with the voice to replicate exactly the same experiment done on the sight restored of Sinha, and it seemed with congenitally blind, and it seemed they can pass their performance in a few tens of hours of training compared to even 2 or 3 or 4 months of use of the visually removed cataract and develop even vantage point, etc. But in 3D, but I still don't see that it can be, and I think it's an interesting question to ask, even if they can surpass and create this representation, it doesn't tell us anything about their subjective representations. So
thank you. So I agree that in the people who've had their cataracts removed, Pravan Singer's experiments say at first, when they've just had their cataracts removed, they can't do the cross-modal task, but they can do the visual matching task, and shortly, not long after, they can come to do that. So I agree. That's exactly the evidence. It was fantastic if you can sort of show a similar pattern of learning using the voice. That's great. That's very interesting. I think again that the nature of the sensory modality is it's answering that. And answering the question of what is the nature of the sensory experience is a very difficult one, and we just have to look at all these pieces of evidence. And as I said, I don't think there's any one test that someone would pass and you'd say, oh, clearly that shows it's vision, or clearly that shows that it's an experience. It looks like we need to sort of just weigh up all the evidence and then sort of make a best guess. It looks like that's the stage that we're at. We're not further forward than that, to my knowledge. Thank you.
Okay, we're out of time, so apologies to those who were in the queue.
Thanks.